Ever heard of a gangster so powerful? He didn't need a gun. Frank Costello didn't just rule the streets, he ruled the people who ruled them. Judges, senators, even presidents listened when he spoke. He was called the Prime Minister of the Underworld, not because of blood on his hands, but because of the secrets in his pockets. He didn't bark orders from a smoky back room. He whispered in the right ears, and the world moved. But here's the strange part. You've probably never heard his full story. Not the Hollywood version, not the mob movie caricature. The real Frank Costello. The man who showed up to a government hearing, stared down a room full of senators, and said almost nothing. The man who built an empire worth millions a week, without ever pulling a trigger. The man who walked into Congress as a mob boss, while millions of Americans watched live on television. Imagine that for a second. You're sitting at home in 1951, black and white TV glowing. The country is gripped by fear of organized crime. And suddenly, on live television, appears a mysterious figure. Not a killer, not a thug, but a man in a suit, calmly lighting a cigarette, gripping a microphone with steady hands. His face hidden, his voice soft. But everyone knows. This is the man who made the Mafia untouchable. How did he do it? How did a poor immigrant kid from East Harlem rise to the top of America's most dangerous organization? Without ever becoming a headline-hungry thug. What did he know about power that others didn't? And how did he stay in charge for decades, while louder, deadlier men around him dropped like flies? This is where it gets even stranger. Frank Costello outlived them all. He survived wars, betrayal, and even a bullet to the head, and still managed to keep his mouth shut. While men like Al Capone rotted in prison, Costello dined with politicians. He didn't dodge the system. He became part of it. Yet for all that power, his end wasn't in a hail of bullets or a courtroom meltdown. His downfall came quietly, from shadows he thought he controlled. In the end, the man who ran the Mafia like a corporation, who made senators tremble with a glance, died alone in a Manhattan apartment. No headlines, no revenge, just silence. But the mystery doesn't end there. Because even after death, Frank Costello's influence lived on. He inspired characters in The Godfather, Boardwalk Empire, and countless crime dramas. FBI agents called him the most influential criminal of all time. And yet, history books barely mention him. Why? Why has his story been buried beneath the louder, bloodier names? Why do we remember the ones who shouted, but forget the one who truly pulled the strings? Maybe it's because Frank Costello didn't care about being famous. He cared about control. And the most dangerous kind of control is the one you never see coming. So if you thought the Mafia was built on bullets and bodies, think again. This story isn't about violence, it's about influence. It's about the man who taught the mob how to act like Wall Street and got away with it. This video uncovers the real story behind the man who ran the Mafia like a business empire, and why his legacy still echoes in today's corridors of power. From street hustler to political puppeteer, from immigrant outsider to America's most silent kingmaker. This is the story of Frank Costello. And trust me, you've never heard it told like this before. Frank Costello wasn't born powerful. In fact, he was born into a life that promised him almost nothing. His real name was Francesco Castiglia. He came from a small village in southern Italy, and like so many others, his family came to America chasing something better. They landed in East Harlem, New York, a place crowded with immigrants, struggling families, and unspoken rules. Life wasn't kind there. The streets were rough, jobs were rare, and for a young Italian boy with barely any money and broken English, the American dream felt more like a cruel joke. But Frank was different. Even as a kid, he paid attention. He watched how things worked. He learned fast. When other kids were wasting time, Frank was running errands for local gangsters, before he was even old enough to drive. Not because he wanted trouble, but because he wanted out. He knew no one was going to hand him a better life, so he took the streets as his classroom. Every job, every deal, every shady favor, he studied it all. Like so many immigrants at the time, Frank tried to make something out of nothing. But while others followed the law, Frank saw that the real money and the real power came from going around it. He started small, petty theft, street scams. Then came prohibition, and everything changed. Suddenly, alcohol was illegal, and suddenly guys like Frank became rich supplying it. He ran illegal booze through underground networks. He built quiet connections. While the country fought over dry laws, Frank got wet, real wet, with cash. But here's the twist. Frank didn't like violence. He wasn't a hitman. He didn't settle problems with fists or guns. He settled them with words. That was his real weapon. He could walk into a room full of angry men and calm it down with a conversation. That made him stand out. Most gangsters ruled by fear. Frank ruled by respect. He was the kind of guy who'd rather shake hands than throw punches. And that's exactly why powerful people started paying attention. Frank didn't climb the ladder alone, though. He formed alliances, smart ones. He teamed up with Lucky Luciano, one of the most feared and respected mob bosses of the time. He worked with Meyer Lansky, the brain behind many of the Mafia's business operations. Together, they didn't just make money, they changed the game. They started to treat crime like a corporation, structured, organized, efficient. And Frank Costello was right in the center of it all. By the 1930s, Frank wasn't just another name in the mob. He was helping build the blueprint for what would soon become the National Crime Syndicate, a network that united gangs across the country under one system. No more random turf wars, no more chaos. Now there were rules, there were territories, there was structure. And behind that structure was a man who didn't need a gun to be feared, Frank Costello. This was no longer about street crime. This was about power, real power, the kind that touched politics, police departments, and even judges. And it all started with a poor immigrant kid from Italy who learned how to play the American system better than the people who built it. Frank's story is the story of a survivor, a hustler, a man who turned every obstacle into a stepping stone. He didn't fit the typical image of a gangster. No flashy violence, no reckless chaos. Just calm confidence, smart decisions, and a talent for turning enemies into allies. That's what made Frank Costello more than just a criminal. That's what made him a legend. As Frank Costello's influence grew, he stopped being just another gangster. He became something more. People started calling him the mob diplomat, a nickname that perfectly captured how he operated. While other mobsters were busy starting wars in the streets, Costello was building an empire in the shadows. He controlled slot machines all across New York City, earning millions every single week. These weren't just small backroom setups either. They were everywhere, in bars, clubs, diners, and hotels. Every time someone pulled that lever, Frank made money. And that money bought him more than just suits and cigars. It bought power. Judges? He had them. Mayors? In his pocket. Even senators? They took his calls. Frank understood something most criminals didn't. Real power doesn't come from fear. It comes from influence. And he had it in spades. While others ruled with guns, Frank ruled with connections. He threw fancy dinners, gave out quiet favors, and made sure the right people owed him. That's how he built a network so strong, even politicians couldn't move without brushing against it. But behind the expensive suits and smooth talk, there was a man who could never fully relax. Frank Costello was constantly surrounded by danger. He walked with calm on the outside, but on the inside he was always watching, always listening. He lived among killers. He made deals with men who wouldn't think twice about putting a bullet in someone's head. And yet, he did everything he could to keep blood off his own hands. That wasn't because he was soft. It was because he was smart. He knew violence brought heat, and heat brought the FBI. Still, no matter how careful he was, betrayal was always around the corner. The Mafia wasn't just about money. It was about power, and power attracts enemies. One of those enemies was Vincent the Chin Gigante, a man who once worked for Frank but later turned against him. In 1957, Gigante tried to assassinate Costello right outside his apartment. He fired a shot that grazed Frank's head. But here's what's wild. Frank didn't die, and he didn't talk. He refused to name his shooter. That silence didn't just save him. It reminded everyone why he was respected. Even when facing death, he kept the code. But that wasn't the only threat. Around the same time, another power player returned, Vito Genovese. Genovese had been locked up but was now back and hungry for control. He wanted what Frank had built, and he wasn't afraid to play dirty to get it. What followed was a quiet but deadly power struggle. Frank, who had always ruled through peace and influence, now found himself cornered by rivals who saw diplomacy as weakness. He could feel the walls closing in. Costello started to pull back. He gave up some of his top positions. Slowly, he began to fade from the front line of the Mafia. But the strange part? That didn't make him disappear. If anything, it made him more famous than ever. Because just as he was trying to step out of the spotlight, the US government dragged him back in. In 1951, Frank Costello was called to testify before the US Senate during a nationally televised hearing about organized crime. It was the first time the American public got to see what a real mob boss looked like. Not in the movies, but in real life. The cameras didn't show his face, only his hands. Millions watched as those hands fidgeted, lit cigarettes, and gripped the table. But here's the part that shocked everyone. Frank barely said a word. He dodged questions, gave vague answers, and when it got too personal, he simply refused to speak. Yet somehow, that silence made him a legend. He became a symbol, not of fear, but of mystery. The man who said nothing, and yet told the whole world exactly how powerful he really was. But how did a gangster manage to testify before Congress without saying a single word, yet still become more famous than ever? It was 1951, and all eyes were on one man, Frank Costello. The setting was the Kefauver Committee hearings, an intense investigation into organized crime. For the first time, the US government was pulling the Mafia into the spotlight. The hearings were broadcast live across the country. Millions of Americans were glued to their TV screens, waiting to see what a real mob boss looked like. But when Frank Costello walked in, something unexpected happened. He refused to show his face. Instead, the cameras focused only on his hands. Just his hands, nervously gripping the microphone, lighting cigarettes, tapping the table. It was a strange sight, and yet somehow unforgettable. That single visual told people everything they needed to know. The trembling fingers, the steady grip, the silence between questions. Frank barely said anything during the hearing. He dodged the toughest questions and avoided giving clear answers. But ironically, it was that silence, the mystery, that made him even more famous. People couldn't stop talking about him. He became a household name not for what he said, but for what he didn't. But the hearings had consequences, serious ones. Up until then, Costello had been protected. He had judges in his pocket, politicians on speed dial, and police officers looking the other way. But once the hearings aired on national TV, everything changed. The people in power, his so-called friends, started backing away. The public wanted answers. The government wanted results. Frank was no longer just a quiet power in the shadows. He was now the face, well, the hands of organized crime in America. And slowly, the cracks started to show. His grip on politics weakened. His enemies, like Vito Genovese and Vincent Gigante, smelled blood. Costello, who once pulled the strings from behind the scenes, began to lose control of the stage. It was the beginning of a long, slow fall. But even as his power faded, his legacy grew. FBI agents once called him the most influential criminal of all time. That's no small title. He inspired major characters in pop culture. Vito Corleone in The Godfather carried shades of Costello's quiet, calculating style. So did Nucky Thompson in Boardwalk Empire. These weren't just fictional mobsters. They were reflections of a real man who proved you didn't need to yell to lead. You just had to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Still, there was a human side to Frank that most people never saw. In his final years, he became a recluse. He didn't throw parties or make backroom deals anymore. He spent his days locked away in his Manhattan apartment, curtains drawn, always looking over his shoulder. He had every reason to be paranoid. He had survived an assassination attempt. He had been betrayed by allies, and he had watched the empire he built slowly slip away. Yet despite all of that, Frank Costello was never convicted of a major crime. Not murder, not racketeering, not even tax evasion. He was too smart, too careful. He knew when to speak and when to disappear. And in the end, that's what he did. He faded quietly, out of the headlines, out of the game, but never out of the story. His life was a contradiction, a mobster who hated violence, a criminal who preferred peace, a man who built an empire in silence and watched it crumble the same way. There's something haunting about that, something human. He had everything, money, power, respect, and yet he ended up alone. No big shootout, no courtroom drama, just an old man in a locked apartment living in the shadow of who he used to be. Frank Costello's story isn't just about crime, it's about power and how quickly it can fade. He walked into history gripping a microphone with trembling hands, and even in silence he said more than most ever could. Frank Costello didn't need to pull a trigger to become one of the most powerful men in American crime. He proved something rare in the world of gangsters, that brains could be just as dangerous as bullets. While others ruled through fear, Frank ruled through influence. He built a network so wide, so quiet, and so deeply rooted that it didn't just shape the streets, it shaped laws, elections, and entire cities. This wasn't just a mob boss. This was a man who made senators pause, who whispered in the ears of judges, who played chess while others were still learning checkers. What made Frank truly different was that he didn't want to be seen. While others chased headlines, Frank avoided them. While other mobsters made noise, he stayed silent. And in that silence, he grew stronger. He became the quiet king behind loud criminals, the shadow that moved the pieces while others took the blame. He didn't wear gold chains or drive flashy cars. He wore suits, made deals, and slipped through the cracks. That's how he lasted. That's how he won. But there's a deeper lesson buried in his story. Real power doesn't always come from shouting the loudest or showing off. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one you don't even notice. The one who knows what to say, who to say it to, and exactly when to disappear. Frank Costello mastered that. But power like that always comes with a cost. Because while Frank rose from nothing, from a kid shining shoes in Harlem to a man who made grown men in Congress sweat, he ended up completely alone. No friends, no family, just silence. The same silence that once protected him now became his prison. He had everything and lost the one thing that matters in the end: peace. They called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld, but the throne he built was made of shadows. And when the lights finally came on, there was nothing left to sit on. So ask yourself, what does Frank Costello's life really teach us? Is power worth chasing if it means losing everything to keep it? Or is true power knowing when to walk away? Frank Costello didn't just leave a mark on the Mafia. He changed how America thinks about power. He showed the world that influence doesn't always come with a gun in your hand. Sometimes it comes with a quiet voice, a handshake, and knowing exactly who to call. He ran his empire without the violence most mobsters relied on, and in doing so, he became more than just a criminal. He became a symbol of invisible control. But as powerful as he was, Frank also paid a heavy price. Behind the success was a man living in fear, a man who couldn't trust anyone, who survived assassination attempts, who watched his closest allies turn into enemies. In the end, all that power couldn't protect him from loneliness. He died in silence. The same silence that once made him a legend. This story wasn't just about crime. It was about control, legacy, and the cost of winning without being seen. Frank Costello played the long game, and for a while, he won. But even kings fall, and when they do, the silence becomes louder than any headline. If you found this story intriguing, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into real-life stories that the history books either ignore or don't want you to know. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Who do you think had more power, Frank Costello or Al Capone? Drop your answer in the comments below. Was it the brain or the brute? The kingmaker or the street legend? Let's settle this once and for all.